It's very handy that Wendy brought up the problem or the need to understand the millennial and Gen Z consumer, because amazingly enough, we have someone whose job it is to help us understand exactly that. So I'm very pleased to introduce Arnaud Roy, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Launchmetrics. Who is missing his podium.
Yeah, well, that's okay. We can do it without. That's not a problem. So, all right. So thank you very much, Vanessa. I'm actually very happy to be here today. I learned a lot during those past 24 hours, so thank you very much for that. My name is Arnaud Roy. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Launchmetrics. For those who are not familiar with this company, we are actually a software and data company helping more than 1,000 fashion, luxury, and cosmetics brands to better connect with their consumers through influencer marketing. For the study that I will present today, we've been partnering with a company called Parklu, who is the premier influencer marketing platform here in China. So to kick off with this presentation and to introduce it, I'd like to start with a number, minus 32%. Minus 32% is how much print advertising investment from luxury brands have been decreasing in the past 5 years across the world. And as we can see, it's not an isolated phenomenon. It's happening in the US, it's happening in China, and it's happening in Europe. So what really happened? Well, what really happened is a word that we've been hearing several times during this conference. It's millennials. Millennials have really forced luxury brands to totally rethink the way that they were connecting with their consumers and the way they were building their communication mix. First of all, because millennials, this generation, they are totally adverse to any type of traditional advertising. They just don't want to be interrupted in their journey. Secondly, because the way that this generation is discovering their products, the way that this generation is getting inspired by brands is not anymore by flipping the pages of fashion magazines. It's much more by connecting with their peers on social media and especially with key opinion leaders or influencers. So the first challenge that is raised for brands is actually how to reconcile the traditional values of exclusivity, prestige that had been in their DNA for so long with values of accessibility, authenticity that are so important for this new generation. Another question is how fast they should move to one model to another. Because when you think about it, it's true that Gucci has more than half of its consumer base composed by millennials already, but it's maybe not your reality, and it's not the reality of the most part of luxury brands today. Boomers and Generation X, like me, we are still representing more than half of the sales in terms of value for luxury brands around the world. So how fast should they move to one model to another, and what is the mix that they should adopt to cope with this new consumer reality? So some first insight about data. We've been analyzing like Chanel and Panerai, which are two very iconic luxury brands. And the first thing that we see here is a bit of contrast. Contrast between Chanel that is already more social media centric and Panerai that is still relying a lot on traditional media. But the most interesting part here is that we see the contrast across regions. Europe, which is still relying a lot on traditional media, and China that has totally switched to social media. So we wanted to understand more about that, and that's why we conducted this study in collaboration with our partner Parklu to understand what was actually the mix used by those luxury brands across the world to connect with their consumers. So we've been crunching data about 100 luxury brands, mainly in the fashion, in the accessories, in the jewelry and watches industry, throughout 2018, and we tried to measure what was the media impact value generated by those brands, which is a proprietary algorithm that we've built, or the earned media value that those brands were creating through different channels, print media, online media, social media, but also, and more importantly, across voices, because the way that today brands are connecting with their consumers is through different types of voices, and they need to arbitrate their investments. Celebrities, traditional media, influencers, of course, but also their own voice through their own Instagram channel, for example, or sometimes retailer that will communicate on their behalf. So what does this mix look like for luxury brands today? So here we can see, first of all, this big contrast across regions. In Europe, the first insight is that, as we saw at the beginning, like traditional media is still representing 60% in Europe of the global media impact value generated by luxury brands. This is huge. If you compare with, for example, beauty and cosmetics, which is another study that we ran lately, this number was less than 20%. So luxury brands are still relying on this voice to convey their values of prestige and exclusivity. What we can see also in Europe is that own media is still representing a strong share of value compared to other regions, and this may be linked to the fact that there are a lot of luxury watches brands there who are really keen in tapping into their fan base. When you communicate on own media, you communicate to people that are already your advocates, and it makes sense, right? Who would be more likely to buy a Rolex than someone that already owns a Rolex? So that can explain this strong own media voice in Europe. And finally, we can see that influencers are absolutely ruling in China. More than 53% of the value, of the media value, is generated through this voice in China. So here we are in Hong Kong today. Let's analyze a bit more what is behind that. First of all, social media penetration and mobile penetration across all layers of the population. Accenture ran a survey lately about the willingness of consumers to buy through social media, and 77% of consumers that were born after 90s were saying that they were actually preferring to buy their product on social media. And this number drops to 44% in the West, almost the half of it. Secondly, culturally, Chinese consumers are a bit skeptical about brands. They tend to mistrust brands, and they rely much more in the recommendation of their peers, but also of the key opinion leaders. And this is confirmed by this survey of IT Kearney, where we can see that 78% of respondents were actually willing to trust more brand promotion tactics that would involve influencers. 78% versus 38%, I think, in the US, and half of it in Europe. So influencers are really ruling in China because consumers trust them much more than brands. When we talk about influencers, we always ask ourselves if we should work with like a handful of like very powerful influencers, or micro, or I heard yesterday in the dinner, nano influencers that would connect maybe more genuinely to your audience. So what does this mix look like for brands across regions? So here again, we can see a real duality between East and West. In China, almost 80% of the value is generated through the highest tier of influencers, like the celebrities and the mega influencers. Whereas in Europe, in the US, it's much more balanced, with more than 50% of the value generated through micro influencers and also through mid-tier influencers. So of course, there may be a demographics explanation behind that, because there is a high concentration of influencers with large following in China. But the main reason is a bit different. The main reason is that when partnering with influencers, brand doesn't want just to have kind of an amplification through their following base. They also want them to create original content that resonates with their audience. And this original content needs to meet certain standards. It needs to be aspirational for the consumers. The reality today is that in China, mid-tier and micro-influencers are not totally professionalized, not as much as in Europe and in the US, which is why Western or even Chinese brands turn much more to top-tier influencers today. Next question is, where are those influencers communicating to reach consumers on behalf of the brands? So if we remember the title of this presentation, Luxury Digital Consumer in a Dual Internet World, well, you have it in front of you, this dual internet world. Two totally separated ecosystems that hardly communicate between each other. In Europe and in the US, Instagram, as Jose was saying, is ruling already with almost 80% of the media value generated versus YouTube, which accounts to like 10% more or less, and Facebook or Twitter that are way behind. Again, in the beauty industry, it would have changed a bit with more prominence and more dominance of YouTube, but in this luxury industry, Instagram rules. In China, we can see that both platforms that are the most well-known, Weibo and WeChat, are capturing like 90% of the total value. In the case of jewelry and watches, we can see that WeChat is actually pretty well implanted because of the success of mini programs that those brands have been launching lately. And we could be surprised by the relatively low share of value of the other networks. We've been analyzing with our partner Parkloo 9 networks. And the 7 others are just 10% of the global value. So a lot of people talk about Redbook, for example. Redbook is extremely driving a very qualified audience with women between 18 and 25 that are very active shoppers, but it's still relatively small in terms of reach. It's like 40 million active users by month. In the case of Douyin, which is a bigger platform, like 400 million active users per month, it's a following base that have been big more in like second, third-tier cities of China with lower income that don't interest so much luxury brands today. So Weibo and WeChat are really capturing most of the value. More interesting is to understand what is the consumer journey across the platform and how it differs from China and the West. In the West, you would start by discovering products on Instagram. Let's say the wedding dress worn by Chiara Ferragni during her wedding, which was designed by Dior. You get inspired by this brand, then you will seek for confirmation with your friends and family, maybe on Facebook. And maybe a few weeks after, you will search on Google and finally buy on Farfetch or Net-a-Porter or offline. So you can see that this journey happens on different platforms. In China, it's a bit different because you could potentially make all this journey across 1 or 2 platforms. Like WeChat, today you can discover products, you can research products, you can buy those products, you can pay for them, and you can even return them if you're not happy with it. So this is much more integrated, and social e-commerce is much more mature in China, where in the Western countries, it's like at the stage of infancy still. That doesn't mean that in WeChat or in Weibo, you should have a tactic that is all about sales. Like generating direct sales through those networks doesn't work. We all have in mind the story of Mr. Bags, this very famous influencer that was able to generate, I think, 200 sales of this very high-priced bags for tots in a few hours. So that's an exception. That doesn't work. And the reality, both in China and in the West, is that you will have to map all these touch points before getting your consumer to buy. And actually, in China, you need twice as much touch points to really have a consumer to buy. According to Atekarni, it was 8 touch points in China versus only 4 in the West. So mapping this consumer journey and be able to create this brand value to maximize your opportunity to convert at each point is really the key here. When it happens, you can see a direct impact in your performance. Like the data that we've been analyzing, and this is from Parkloo, we found a correlation, a direct correlation between the media impact value generated by key opinion leaders and sales, like 70% correlation between this media impact value and Tmall sales for a fashion accessory brand. In Europe, we almost found a very strong correlation between what was actually the media impact value, the brand equity that was created, and the stock price. And actually, it makes sense. Like UBS, for example, I read an article recently, they are already using this type of metrics to predict brand performance and to inform their investment decisions. So to wrap up, we've seen many differences between East and West in the way brands are connecting with their consumers, like a mix that is much more about influencers in China, still on traditional media in Europe and in the US. A different mix in terms of influencer, more higher tier influencers in China versus mid-tier and lower tier in the West. We've seen that those platforms are connected hardly together, like 2 different ecosystems in terms of social media, but one point in common is that you need to map the consumer journey and you don't need to exploit from those strategies to directly generate sales. So mapping the consumer journey, understanding who you are selling to, where you are selling to, in which market, will be the last takeaway that I will have for this presentation.
Thank you. Okay, I have one question, and then I'll let you guys have at him. If you were going to suggest one thing that brands needed to know going forward, so not what it is now, but what's going to matter next, what would you say to them?
I would say that like influencer marketing is obviously for China or for the West?
Both.
Both of it. I think it's a lot about content creation. So the way that influencers are helping brands traditionally it was more about amplifying content, and now it's much more about partnering with those brands to create content that really match with the consumer expectations. So the way to coordinate this effort, the way to really have a content that is different from the brand's voice, because this is what they are seeking, right? Is really what will matter in the future.
That's interesting, because it reminds me of what Remo Ruffini and John Hoke and Daniela Riccardi were saying yesterday about the reason for creating kind of networks of collaborators, that it allows a brand to sort of pitch itself to a whole different demographic while maintaining its own equity. It's a similar idea.
Different voices. So as a brand, you have your own voice that you can perfectly express through social media, through your blog, or through any kind of channels. But you are lending the voice of the media, of influencers, to maybe convey a slightly different message that would connect differently to your audience.
Although it's risky too.
It can be risky.
They can go off piste. All right. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, in the front.
Kind of going off what you were just saying about content, I was wondering if you could speak to more about the type of content, since not only is it increasing, I know like video on Instagram captures 5 times more eyeballs than pictures, but now you have people and companies who are producing like highly produced Instagram stories as well. So I'm wondering if you're seeing I'm wondering what type of trends you're seeing in the types of content produced, both in the West and the trends in China as well.
Sure. Yeah, so in the West, Instagram stories, when we look at, for example, an event involving influencers, Instagram stories are generating like 3 times more media value than Instagram posts, like just images. So that's already happening, and this is a key way of conveying the message brand. In China, something that is really working right now is live streaming. There is a lot of platform that allows this live streaming to showcase product, and influencers are really professional in reaching their audience through this way, and this is the clear evolution that we are seeing right now in this market.
Hi, Jonathan from LVMH. The recent news regarding some high-profile celebrities and tax evasion in China, how do you think that will impact their influence on consumers moving forward, and more importantly, the rebalance of building brands versus using celebrities to drive business? Sure.
So an interesting thing that we've seen about brands using celebrities, like for example, Rihanna for Fenty Beauty in the US, is that it has like an echo effect. So you're using the voice of the celebrity, but then the way that the media, for example, will talk about it is involving a lot of celebrities. So when you use celebrities, traditionally, the media voice is also very strong. Influencers are more like the direct connection to the consumer, and I think we are seeing different strategies that, like the mix, as we said, is really to be matched with your final audience, and celebrities can be a perfect tactic when we are launching, for example, cosmetics product. You also have influencers right now that are launching their own beauty and cosmetics brands, using their voice as a celebrity to reach their audience. So I think the thing is to find the right balance with all those voices.
Any other questions? One in the back.
Hi, good morning. Charles Dent from Erno Laszlo. I'm very interested in your view on loyalty and the role the influencers play as gatekeepers. Does the brand use the influencer to develop the relationship and then opt out thereafter, or does the influencer have a long-term partnership with the brand to continue the cycle?
Sure. So today, influencer marketing or KOL marketing is more about sponsoring. So it's hard, except for micro-influencers, to get pure organic coverage. That said, the way that a brand is able to involve the influencers at every stage, for example, of the journey, from their product development, to involve them in the way to provide them feedback very early in this development, is creating this relationship and helps to get much more impact down the road. What is funny also is that in luxury we see much more loyalty of influencers than, for example, in beauty and cosmetics. Like a typical video of an influencer on beauty and cosmetics would name like 10 brands in the same content. In luxury they are much more loyal and they tend to partner with less brands and have like a more clear voice, I would say.
Okay, we are out of time for this one. I'm sure that if you have more questions, Arnaud will be here afterwards. You can accost him if you want down there. And I just want to remind everyone to please sign up for your chosen leadership roundtable right now. You can choose creativity, technology, or globalization, the challenges therein. It will be, I promise, a really valuable part of this experience. And hopefully I will see you there. And then you'll come back here at 11 so we can divide up into the rooms. Thank you.